Hello everybody, welcome to today's talk, and thank you for joining us today in the Hackney's first ever History Festival. For a change, I thought I would introduce a session and maybe do an interview with a few questions to Eithne, who has written this amazing book. It's just come out called Child Migrant Voices in Modern Britain. So it will be a role reversal, because normally Eithne is interviewing me, asking the questions. So if I may start. Eithne, what made you write this book?
Okay, so Lynn, thank you. It's a pleasure to be interviewed by you, the role reversal. So when I was working at the V&A, I was asked to curate this gallery at what was then the V&A Museum of Childhood, that maybe you know, and that was to collect different voices and objects from the diverse communities in East London. So we employed people from different communities, the Somali, the Bangladeshi, the Vietnamese, from different communities, and we created a gallery between us. And that became the inspiration for Queen Mary University of London and the V&A to put in a bid to do some research, a PhD research, into child migration, building on the experience of the world in the East End. So I applied and got the job, or got the study. But also I became more and more concerned about this focus on first generation child migration, because I didn't realize that under almost 50% of the people who are displaced in the world today are under the age of 18. And there is very little focus comparatively on children. So it became more and more important that I thought the research was really important. And the research was research initially to East London, which is when I met Lynn.
I think I have to admit that I am very grateful for Eithne writing the book, because my story is in a section of the book, which I wasn't too happy at the time, Eithne asking me all these probing questions. And so for the book, how was the book different than your initial research that started your own journey into this writing?
Yeah. Okay, so initially, I always wanted to do a book which was to broader appeal, which was not just for other academics or other students, but had a broader appeal for those interested in powerful life stories, those working with child migrants, and those who know child migrants, and also the families and communities of child migrants themselves. And so the book is really quite different. It's organized historically, so it begins in the 1930s with Orthodox children who came on the Kindertransport to Stamford Hill, and it ends with children who came from Ukraine and actually came to Horsham, not to Hackney, but there are lots of Hackney stories. But it's also different in that in the chapters intervene, including yours, it's very much the voices of the people I interviewed who really lead us, you know, into the shops or where the homes they lived, or the places they came from, you know, where they fought the fascists on the street, or where they became businessmen or women. So it's really the child migrant voices, as adults too, who drive this book. Although there are themes at the beginning in the introduction, and in the last chapter I'd bring it really up to date with the politics, and Robert Jenrick ordering for murals to be painted out not to welcome child migrants, if you remember all that. So it does, in fact, I was writing it at the last minute to that.
So it's been a journey for you as well, hearing
absolutely.
all the different stories.
Yeah.
Maybe if you can give us some examples of some of the stories featured in the book.
Yeah. Sure, and of course there are quite a lot of Hackney stories, because I've lived and worked in Hackney for decades. I live literally 5 doors down this street. I used all my personal contacts of people I've worked with and got to know in shops. So the book starts with Blanca, who came on the Orthodox, who still lives in the same house that she came to when she was 8. She slept with 40 other children from the Kindertransport in Manor House, literally, and she still lives in the same house. It's a wonderful story. Then there was Duncan, who was an Anglo-Asian priest who died very recently, but who went to Hackney Downs School and remembers learning the Russian, trailing round Hackney Downs, learning behind the Russian teacher, learning Russian. And then there's Argan. I don't know if you remember Argan Stationers under the Sharps. Well, he had an amazing story. He came from Cyprus, and he brought his photograph. It was the only thing he brought with him was his photograph album that he rescued from his grandfather's bombed-out house, and that becomes a whole film that we've done. Then there were 2 people who came from Jamaica in the same year, one of whom got caught up in the Windrush scandal as an adult, and was, nearly deported. And then there was Morris, who we've done lots of work with. Morris, who's a reggae artist now, who was caught up in the Biafra War. We made a film about him. Henry, who was a poet, artist. He was a child soldier from El Salvador. So these are all Hackney stories. Alem, who some of you may know from Brew for Two. It was a cafe around the corner in Morning Lane. She was a Kurdish Alevi, faced discrimination. Didn't really find out about her Kurdish Alevi identity until she came here, because it was so suppressed in Turkey. And Mariam is the latest Hackney one. She was on our panel. She had a very moving story about having to flee Guinea because her sister had died of FGM and she was being threatened with it herself. And so she arrived in Guinea on her own and is now a nurse on the south coast, a theatre nurse, and had incredible challenges to face. So a lot of them are Hackney stories, and great.
I know I'm biased by saying how brilliant the book is, but it's filled with, you would go through lots of fun times reading it, emotional times, and some of the stories would make you burst out laughing because they're so heartfelt. But I wanted to ask also, as together with your research in the book, you also made films.
Yeah.
What made you do the films before the book?
Well, I suppose because it was linked to the Museum of Childhood, and in the World East End, we'd already done a film about a Rwandan refugee, and it had gone in the gallery, and it had been really powerful. But also, I met people like you, who we did, as part of the interview process, we did drawing exercises. So Lynn is a great artist, so we had these wonderful drawing to draw on. Morris is a great singer, so and also Henry was a poet, an artist, and a singer, and Ruhal was a filmmaker. So I was meeting all these people with incredible skills. So it just seemed to be a fantastic opportunity to work with people and to co-produce films together. And we had one of the great things about the film with Lynn, which we can see now, is we went back to well, you say it. Where did we go back to?
Yes, the good thing about the film is we went back to the refugee camp that my father and myself stayed in. I've never been back since I left there when I was 7 years old. So we had to get special permission from the Ministry of Defence because it's an ex-army camp and it's still an army camp.
Yeah.
But you will see some of this in the film.
Yeah.
No matter how many times I've seen the amazing film that you've done, it always leaves a little lump in my throat, and it brings you back to that 7-year-old girl. Yes, so with your question, the experiences of my brother and sister and mother who were left behind in Vietnam, they had to cope with the Vietnam War and the aftermath. Also the change in government when the communists took over the whole of Vietnam. They were constantly interrogated and questioned about why did my father and myself left, because he was a local professor, a university professor and a counsellor, so he was very outspoken with his views. And they had to cope with quite a lot of bribery as well with the police, just to minimise the questioning and interrogation. This went on for 5 years, because it took 5 years for them to join us in the UK. It wasn't from the UK's end, but I think it was difficult for them to leave. They were reluctant to let them go. But the difference as well is, compared to that contrast of they had to cope with more responsibilities, my siblings also virtually filling my dad's role and myself's role that we left behind. But also on myself, my behalf, I was plucked away as a 7-year-old leaving Vietnam. And even though I was with my father going on this journey, or after arriving in England, I still felt almost like an orphan, because my comfort zone was gone. So it was strange. But on the other side of that, the members of staff from the camp that my dad worked with, both English internationals and other Vietnamese staff, they virtually adopted me as their little sibling. So I had lots of favourite uncles and aunties.
So can you tell us, it's great to see the picture of your father. Can you tell us a little more about An Viet and his work?
Yes, so An Viet started out when we arrived. We finally resettled in Hackney. After leaving the camp, we were actually in Bognor Regis first for only a few months, but it was only a few months by choice, because after being in the community's environment in the camp, being displaced by yourself in Bognor Regis, it felt completely sort of the sense of desolation, seaside. There were no other people that we knew around there. So I think after a few months we kind of found our way and made our way to Hackney. Hackney, I must admit, hence the theme of this weekend's festival, was really welcoming. It was one of the few boroughs that took the refugees, when other boroughs didn't really want to take any refugees then. So the foundation started out with people knocking on Dad's door, asking for advice from English interpretation, how do I get my kids into a school, health advice, how do I enroll in doctors, surgery, daily life. After a while, knocking on our doors got a bit too much, and with the help again of Hackney Council, he eventually found a permanent resident for the community centre in Dalston, in the Vietnamese Centre and NVIT Foundation. And again, I think I like to emphasise the fact that without the help, compared to what's going on now in the news, but without that initial welcome that we had in the beginning in the 1970s, down to local support from Hackney Council, government support nationwide, it enabled my dad to set up the community centre to help other Vietnamese to settle, and basically he wanted to carry on the warm welcome that we received, and almost to pay back Britain for being accepting us. I think that was the difference. He wanted to give back, And that was always drummed into me when I was young, you must work hard, etc., etc. So I think it's that level of gratefulness is reflected in the clear structure that we had when we came over and the warm support.
Great. I think now that we'll open it up to questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question of Lynn or myself. Yes.
How did your father find a job here?
So he started out being a member of staff in the camp because he was a university lecturer, so he knew English already, so that was a natural progression for him. And with the job, he was volunteering when he came to Hackney to various other enterprises and charities, and he was quite smart in the way he identified, and together we wanted to give back to society. He wanted to carry on that support, and I think that's missing from current day. So refugees are kind of left to it. He realised that they need to be an ongoing support from the camp to everyday life, to actually equipping people with skills, and virtually to try to make himself sufficient in Hackney, building on the skills that they had already, which started out as actually clothes-making factories in the 80s. He started training people with clothes-making, and they went to work for many of the factories around Hackney, and this led on to training of nail shops, nail technicians that you see now, that's over the last 40 years, to basically the first Vietnamese restaurant within the centre, and now virtually little Hackney has become Little Vietnam. So it has grown from there, and I think that's my father using the skills that he had learnt in the camp to identify what people needed, he trained them up.
Yes, do you want?
I just wanted to know, because you must know your dad was at a skill, or because you can't just go and get a volunteer. Can you remember the process?
Yes, so it was really strange, because I remember sort of the whole journey. We had to hide in the reeds, as we saw in the film, and waiting for a smaller boat to take us to the boat that would leave Vietnam waters. And then I remember being at sea. There were lots of issues in the 70s with pirates in the horizon. They knew lots of people were escaping Vietnam at that time, leaving with all their valuables, whatever they had. So there were lots of atrocities at sea at that time. We were lucky. We didn't encounter pirates back then, but there are many horrific, stories of rape, violence, murder at sea. So I remember it quite well. But interestingly, sort of furthering on from making the film, before we went back to the camp to make the film, I was trying to remember where to shoot the film once we got there. So I was relying on my memory the few days before, as a child from a 7-year-old, where I lived with the other members of staff, and just the circulation that I used to do as a 7-year-old, and I actually managed to pinpoint on the fate map that we had of the Ministry of Defence where exactly our house was. So that must have had quite a big impact on me, to trying to retrace my steps of where we were. So yes, it's quite strange, but I do remember certain moments quite clearly.
What about the time when you were there, because the war was going on? Do you remember?
I'm sorry, we're going to have to... sorry, but we're really...
We have time for one more question here, and then if people want to carry on the discussion outside while we set up the business.
Okay. Okay. Can I just, instead of the one question, read out just a paragraph from the book? Is that all right? Okay. So, my research has deepened my connection to East London. I can no longer pass Blanca's house on the 106 in Stamford Hill, without hearing the laughter, but also the cries of 40 Kindertransport children as they lay on camp beds in Rabbi Schonfeld's house. Or walk across Hackney Downs without remembering how Duncan learnt to chant Som soy som sami as he marched behind his Russian teacher, plonking a musical instrument. When I drive down Rectory Road, I can't help smiling at Morris and his brother, scratching out the eyes of Sooty and Sweep in their newly decorated bedroom, thinking they were demons. When I follow the canal towpath where we first screened Passing Tides on the floating cinema, I remember the moment Lynn's daughter first understood her mother's fear of water. Okay.